everyone, and welcome back to Coast Connections for part 2 of our special 75th anniversary of D-Day commemorative episodes. And today we're going to be talking about the Juno Beach Center itself. We're going from 1944 to 2019, what it looks like on the beach now, and the amazing memorial that's been created there and museum. And to guide us through that, we have Scott Entwhistle. Welcome back, Scott.
Thanks for having me again.
You're very welcome, yeah. Seems like I just saw you.
Exactly.
Yeah. And Scott, your role there at the Juno Beach Center is the...
So I'm the Special Projects Coordinator for the Juno Beach Center Association, which is the private association in Canada which owns and operates the center in France. Yeah.
Now, tell us, Scott, how the Juno Beach Center came to be and who the founders of this were. I understand it was all volunteers.
Yes, exactly.
Just like our Canadian Army was 99% volunteers.
Exactly, yeah.
The
so
Juno
just like
Beach Center.
Every single Canadian landed and fought in Normandy, all 90,000 Canadian soldiers in 1944 were volunteers. They volunteered to go overseas and cross the Atlantic and then cross the Channel. It was a volunteer effort in 1994 when the museum was first kind of thought of. So it was a group of veterans of the 14th Field Regiment specifically. A man named Garth Webb, who had landed on D-Day with that unit, went as a larger cohort of veterans going for the 50th anniversary of D-Day in 1994. And when they went, there were monuments, and of course there were the cemeteries that were beautifully maintained, but there was no place that told the story. There was no museum, there was no real Canadian center that could explain to people what the Canadians had done here. And they noticed that, you know, the British and the Americans had done something, the Canadians had not. And so...
And this is 1994.
This is 1994.
So this is like, what, 50 years?
Yeah, and Garth Webb at this point is 77 years old. The veterans are all 70s, 80s. The youngest would have been in their early 70s at this point. So it's in 1995 that they really decide, you know what, we're going to build something on Juno Beach. And it takes 8 years to raise $10 million. Some of that was Government of Canada, some of that was corporate, but a lot of that was simply everyday Canadians coming out and giving whatever money they could to get this museum built. So we opened our doors in 2003 and have been operating ever since for the last 16 years.
Fantastic. Yeah. And you've provided some really good drone footage for us here, Scott, so we can actually have an aerial view of the Juno Beach Center and what it looks like now. We saw some footage in our previous episode about what it looked like on the beach then.
Yeah,
here we go.
This is the Juno Beach Center. It's in Courseulles-sur-Mer in Normandy, France. So it's only about 100 meters off the beach itself in the section where the Royal Winnipeg Rifles came ashore on D-Day. And so this land, after the war, was actually just a municipal camping ground. And when the museum was being conceived of, the local government in Courseulles offered it up for €1. We've been leasing the land ever since. So yeah, it's definitely a Canadian and a French effort to get this built. It wasn't just Canadian veterans. There was a huge network of support in France. A lot of French civilians that had been there during the war, that had survived the landings, that came out and said, we want to help the Canadians come over. And if anyone here has been to Normandy, you'll have noticed that there are Canadian flags flying in every single village. There are streets named after Canadians. Avenue des Canadiens is a very common street name. And so the Normans certainly have not forgotten the Canadian contribution to the landings.
Wonderful. So the building took how many years to complete?
So it took 8 years from conception. I believe the construction was about 2 or 3 years to actually get the center built in the end there. And so opened our doors in 2003. And
we have some shots of that, of the I believe the Prime Minister Chrétien opened the museum.
Of the inauguration,
We've got a couple of photos there, and I believe the Queen attended too.
The Queen was there, Chrétien was there. It was a big moment. All the veterans got together. I believe they had several hundred, if not several thousand veterans at that point were able to go and attend that anniversary. Because it was also 2003 was the inauguration, and then 2004 right afterwards was the 60th anniversary. So that was a very busy period. This is from the inauguration itself, though. That's just out front of the museum. That statue called Remembrance and Renewal, and it's supposed to kind of show Canadians, or soldiers at least, coming out of the waves as kind of a tribute to the soldiers that came ashore. And the man standing next to Chrétien there, second from the left, that's Garth Webb. So that's the man who really is responsible for this museum, is the reason that it was built. And he unfortunately passed away in 2012. Rather symbolically, though, he passed away on May 8th, which is Victory in Europe
Day. Yeah, isn't that something? Yeah.
So one of the things the museum really wanted, the founders, the veterans wanted to have, was to have young Canadians that were the same age as the soldiers that were landing there, being the ones giving the tours, talking to visitors.
Such as yourself,
So
Scott.
this is how I got involved in this. So ever since 2003, we've operated a student guide program. University students have gone over and worked for a couple months and really just given these tours and made the history come alive and talk to visitors as they come in. So I was fortunate enough to do that for about 2 years. One of the main things we do is give tours of the bunkers that we have outside. So this is one of them. The previous picture was the other. So part of that strong point that defended the beach in 1944. Now you can go in it and explore it for yourself and see how it was built and see what was going on there.
What have we got there?
So those are tank traps, tetrahedrals. The idea there, you put those on the beach where the tide is coming in. You plant a landmine on top of them. And so when it's low tide, it stops vehicles from getting through. When it's high tide, a landing craft coming in is going to hit the top of that and the bottom's going to blow out.
Oh my God.
The landings that were supposed to come in right at low tide actually came in a bit late, and so a lot of landing craft ended up hitting the mines that were affixed to the top of those obstacles. And now that's the cemetery, the American cemetery at Courseulles-sur-Mer, and so it gets that kind of very artistic and very beautiful pattern with the crosses there. And the Americans do cemeteries a bit differently than the Commonwealth do. Americans tend to do much larger cemeteries. So I believe there's about 10,000 American soldiers buried in that cemetery. Commonwealth cemeteries tend to be smaller and a bit more intimate in the way they're kind of presented. But that is a fantastic cemetery right there. And now that's Canada House, the famous house that's in a lot of pictures on D-Day. It remarkably stood. Garth Webb was told by a planning officer before D-Day a picture of that house with a naval officer very confidently saying, when you land, that house will be gone, as a symbol of how good the bombardment was. And Garth Webb lands in front of that house, and there it is standing with a few scratches on it, but ultimately standing pretty well. So.
And the Germans had used that as some of the generals were staying in there, were they not?
Not quite. It was a resistance point. And so the Queen's Armed Rifles of Canada who land there suffer about 100 casualties in the environs of the house. So it means a lot to them coming ashore, and it's just very prominently featured in a lot of the pictures.
And here it is today.
And there it is today. So it's actually a duplex. The family that owns the left side of the house is very welcoming to Canadians and loves to give visits. Unfortunately, Helve Offer, who was the owner, passed away last winter, but Nicole, his wife, still loves to visit or have Canadians come and welcome them. And there's a ceremony there, a beautiful ceremony. If anyone's in Normandy on June 6th, I could not recommend it more. There's a pipe band that plays, and they take a lantern that they've been hanging in the house all day, and they walk it out about 9 o'clock, and they throw it in the ocean, returning it to the sea. And it's honestly one of the most touching things that I've ever been to. So.
How beautiful. Yeah. And how nice to see that home fully restored and people enjoying the beautiful beach.
Exactly.
Out there on the Normandy coast, because those are fantastic beaches.
Yeah. For sure.
Now, no museum or memorial can survive without money.
Exactly.
You've got a very interesting fundraiser going on, Scott, with the dog tags.
We do, yeah.
Yeah, let's talk about that.
So it's a special program that we're running for the 75th anniversary of D-Day. And so for the 70th anniversary of D-Day, what we did a marker program. So we got 359 markers sponsored, one for every Canadian that died on D-Day. And so Canadians could sponsor those markers, and then we put them up at the museum in Normandy. Now, for the 75th, we wanted to do something similar, but we wanted to make it more accessible and wanted to make it not just D-Day, but the Battle of Normandy, because that's one of the important things is it wasn't over at D-Day. There was still 90 days of the Battle of Normandy to go. So there are 5,500 Canadian soldiers that died during the Battle of Normandy and are buried in France today. So we conceived these dog tags, the idea being that people could sponsor these tags. On the green tag, if you want to turn that around, there is the name of a Canadian soldier that was killed in France, and then on the red tag, donors could put their own information. They could put themselves or a little quote if they'd like to, or even their family member sponsoring that Canadian that didn't make it back, maybe with one that did, or someone that served in Korea, or anything really that they wanted to put. We wanted to give people that chance to sponsor this Canadian and also learn that story, because I think it's important. I think when you go to these cemeteries, again, it's easy to get caught up in the numbers. 90,000 served, 5,000 died, 1.1 million during the war, but every single one of these people was a person. They had a life story. They had hopes and aspirations and dreams that they cut short. They volunteered. They said, no, I'm going to defer my medical school, or I'm going to leave my family, or I'm going to leave the bride that I just married. I'm going to sign up and I'm going to go fight overseas. And so I think if you know the story of one, and this is something that we try and get across, especially to kids, is that, if you know one of those stories, then you start to think as you're walking through, well, every single one of these gravestones has the same background. And unfortunately, a lot of these stories are simply lost to time. There's
I love
no
how
more
you are trying to keep that alive, and how every one of these dog tags has the name of one of the Canadian soldiers who fell.
So I did a lot of research over the summer on Canadians that fell, and again, some really fascinating stories that came out of it. There was one where there was 19 children in the family, and so the oldest signed up to fight in Normandy, and he unfortunately passed away. And so the youngest child, though, was born in 1946, named after the brother, and that youngest child then signed up to join the Canadian Forces, and unfortunately passed away serving in Cyprus on a UN peacekeeping mission. So there's one generation, but 50 years separated, essentially, of service to Canada. And a lot of these guys, again, they came from absolutely everywhere, every single class. Farm boys from Regina, Saskatchewan, brand new immigrants from Eastern Europe, up into including the nephew of the Prime Minister of Canada in the 1930s, R.B. Bennett. His two nephews actually passed away in Normandy. They lost their lives fighting there. So really just every end of the spectrum, from a 16-year-old to a 43-year-old. This was everyone fighting. This was all of Canada. This wasn't, one type of person. There were, Asian Canadians, Chinese Canadians, Japanese Canadians, Black Canadians, even Asian Canadians at that time did not even have the right to vote, and yet they signed up to fight and to go overseas and fight for Canada.
And the 50,000 women that also served.
Exactly. Yes.
And they lobbied the government to serve because they wanted to be able to play a role. And one of the women who lobbied the hardest was Elizabeth Windsor. Lobbied her own father, the king, and got herself. She put down her purse and picked up a wrench, and became a mechanic and drove a military vehicle during the war.
There were about 3,000 nurses that served in combat. Not Normandy; those figures we can't quite find, but in combat in general. Definitely putting their lives on the line, serving as much as they could. Others that served in vital code-breaking operations, actually. There were some very interesting stories that came out of women that served in the Naval Reserve, whose job it was to crack the Enigma machine, essentially, and deliver those important messages.
And women who cracked some of the aerial photography. And again, that was key elements that helped turn the stage of the war in terms of the V rocket.
Yes, exactly. So the rockets that Germany was launching, the V weapons, so V1 and V2, and actually what the Allies did is they reported back. They had radio reports saying that the rockets were landing north of London when they were actually landing in London. But the Germans hear these messages and think, okay, we have to land them 50 kilometers further to the south. So most of the V1s and V2s actually land in the south of England because the Germans had thought that they were hitting too far north. So those are the kind of things that you can deceive them into thinking that things happening. But going back to female veterans, I actually met a woman by the name of Mary MacDonald about a month ago, and she was a major in the army during the war, and her job was to basically go to Halifax and meet war brides that were coming back to Canada. So this was European women that Canadian soldiers had met and married and then wanted to bring back to Canada. And she would meet them here in Halifax and then escort them to wherever they were going in Canada and get them settled. So she would take the train with them to Regina or even Vancouver, get them settled in their home, and then go back to Halifax and do it all again.
The national welcome wagon.
Exactly.
The welcome train.
Not a job you would think existed, but there's this lady, and she's 100 years old today, lives in Vancouver, and is still doing well. So
good for her. That's fantastic.
That's a fantastic story.
Let's talk about your educators tour that you also do there.
Yeah, so since 2006, almost every year with a few in between, we've been running a summer institute over the summer. So it's a 2-week battlefields tour with museum staff and one of our historical experts who goes around, visits the First and Second World War sites, and basically not only teaches the history, but teaches how to teach the history. So there's a lot of professional development that happens there. There's a lot of talking about, well, how do we take this history? Because when you're there, it is particularly easy to connect with it. It's right in front of you. You can see what's going on. But for most people, traveling to Normandy isn't going to happen, or it's not that easy. And so how do we kind of, convey this history, especially in a classroom, to kids and make them care about this thing that happened so far away and so long ago?
And how many, it's mostly teachers that go, right?
So it's been teachers every year since 2006. So we have 20 a year, so we've got over 150 to 200 teachers now that are alumni of this program.
Fantastic.
But we've modified it slightly this year, so we're still doing our teacher tour this summer, but we're also doing a student tour as well for the first time. So we're very excited about that. I'm very excited about that because I get to go and talk about the history.
You're their leader.
Exactly. Yeah. It's going to be a lot of fun. So we have 24 high school kids from across the country that applied to this. They had to answer the question, how do you personally feel connected to the experience of Canadians during the Second World War? And they could write an essay or do a digital project or a video statement, and we were just blown away by the quality of the applications. There were so many kids that just cared so much and produced such amazing work that I honestly had such difficulty choosing. It was almost impossible to wind it down to the final 24. But
and it's a 2-week tour that you're taking them on?
Exactly, yeah.
And it's World War I and World War II,
exactly,
I believe.
Yeah. So we didn't want to just do World War II. We wanted to show that, you know, twice Canada went over in the
Yes.
space of 20 years, 30 years, and fought for, you know, their freedom, but also European freedom. And so we're going to do World War I at first, and then go over to Dieppe, and then down to Normandy. And one of the important things about this is every single student is going to research a soldier that passed away, that lost their life in Europe during the Second World War. Again, with that idea that when they're walking through the cemeteries, and especially in the First World War, there are cemeteries with 10,000 graves in them. It's hard to kind of fathom that these were people, but again, with the idea of if they know one, then they can realize that there are the rest of them. One in particular we're excited for is that we have the great-granddaughter of a paratrooper that landed on D-Day by the name of Richard Lacroix. He landed on June 5th, basically at midnight, one of the first paratroopers to come, and he was killed in action, unfortunately, almost immediately in a very small town called Saint-Vaast-en-Auge. And the townspeople of that town, though, there are 4 paratroopers buried in that churchyard. Every single year since 1944, they've taken his helmet and they put it on his grave on June 5th as an act of remembrance. And the helmet is actually now in the museum in the Juno Beach Center most of the year, but on June 5th still they come and they take the helmet and they walk and they take it back to their village.
Wow.
And they put it there. And we're going to have a small ceremony for Richard with the students and with the townspeople when we're there. So
it's so beautiful how the French people are keeping this memory alive of their liberation by the Canadians. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. It's fantastic.
Now, you've also got the Maple Leaf Route cycling tour.
We do, yeah.
And in our last clip, we saw the Canadian soldiers landing with their bicycles.
Exactly.
Was that the start of the Maple Leaf cycling tour?
I think this might be slightly less dangerous than those cyclists had to go. But yeah, the idea with that is that cycle tours in Europe are increasingly popular. People like to, you know, get on their bikes, get a bit of exercise, and see Europe in a different way. And it's a fantastic way to see the countryside. French truck drivers make it a bit more exciting, maybe, than you'd want it to be, but it's still a great way to do it. And this way you can do this cycling tour, but also hit the major landmarks and essentially follow the Canadians as they were liberating Northwest Europe.
So if one were to do the cycling tour, how many kilometers would you be covering?
It's a couple hundred, I believe. I'm not exactly sure off the top of my head. But
and place to rent bikes there is fairly accessible?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think you definitely want to prepare for that. I don't think you want to show up and say, we're going to rent a bike and we're going to do this. But and if the cycle tour is a bit too much too, that's the great thing is you can just rent a bike for a day and go and kind of explore that way. It's not too difficult to do.
Good. Let's talk about the commemorative brick fundraiser that you have as well, Scott.
Yeah, so this is the other kind of fundraising program that we have going. This one we're kind of in the stages of wrapping up because this was the initial money that built the Juno Beach Center, essentially. So we're talking about that $10 million that was raised back in the 90s. The personal contributions were mostly these bricks. There are 13,000 of them now outside the museum, many with the names of veterans that served, others with names of groups or organizations or simply individuals that wanted to donate to the construction of this museum. So people can still sponsor a brick, and I believe you have the brick that you've sponsored that you'd like to share with us.
We sponsored a brick for my dad, Lance Corporal William Heinz, who served from 1939 to 1946, and we put on it to our courageous and gentle father, because he was such a gentle man, and as many of these soldiers were, and to think that they had to go through this horrific experience is pretty daunting.
Yeah, exactly.
So I went over in 2015 to see the brick. This is a wooden replica, but the real brick, they're made of titanium.
Yes, exactly.
Which speaks to the titanium spirit of these soldiers.
Exactly, yeah, it does. It really does. One, it's as a guide, one of the things that would happen very often was always one of the best is people would come in and say, I have a brick, I want to see it, I want to get a picture with it. And so,
gee, Scott, that was me in 2015.
And that was you, and that was me that took the picture. So
isn't that funny? And this is the first time we're connecting since then.
And it's one of the great things, and again, I was saying this before, but there's a kind of a sense that all Canadians know each other, and that was never more true than it was at the center. I swear every single day someone would come in that one of the guides inevitably knew, and we always had to ask people where they were from for our statistics, but they'd say, oh, where are you from? Oh, I'm from BC. Okay, where in BC?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm from Kelowna. Where in Kelowna? And then inevitably it would be your elementary school principal, or it would be these people that, the most random connections, but it would happen all the time, that, 5,000 kilometers from home, visiting a site that's important to Canadians, and the people that are working there are Canadian, and you happen to know them because they happen to have been the person, that taught your uncle how to teach piano or whatever. And it happened constantly. It was kind of insane.
It's really cool. It must be such an honor for you to serve there, especially in the footsteps of your grandfather, who was a veteran.
Well, and it was something I always said to people is, again, having the guides be university students is such a poignant example of these guys weren't 20, well, some of them were 25, but a lot of them were 21, 22. And it's something that I would always tell groups that when I was the visitor services manager there, is I was in charge of the guide team.
Yeah.
But I was in charge in the sense that I made sure they got to work on time and that they knew what they were talking about. Yeah. Garth Webb was 22 when he landed, and he was a lieutenant, and he was in charge of 10 men. But he was in charge of making sure they survived to the next day.
Yeah.
And so he actually, when he lands on D-Day, makes a decision, and as a result of that decision, 5 of his men are killed. And so you can't say that was the wrong decision to make. He had to make a decision, but he had to live with that for the rest of his life. And you have 23 and 24-year-olds that are captains and majors that are in charge of 130, 140 men, making sure they get through it to the next day. And incredibly young to have such a massive burden placed in your hands. There's one story in particular, it's in one of the dog tags that you can sponsor, is a man by the name of Ernest Cockburn, who was a captain in 1944. And Canada at that point, the Army, had a lot of junior officers, lieutenants and captains, and so he wasn't going to see action with the Canadian unit. The British, though, were desperate for junior officers, so Canadians could volunteer again, after having volunteered so many previous times, to serve in a British unit. And so he gets to this unit, and the commander tells him point blank, look, I'm going to lose 90% of my platoon commanders on D-Day. Do you still want to go? And he says, well, I came to fight, so yeah, I'm going to go. And he is killed in action on June 12th, knowing full well that he signed up for this, and in charge of, again, 130 men when he lands.
As a young man himself. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
No,
now, Scott, the 75th anniversary is coming up on June the 6th.
Yes.
And what is the Juno Beach Centre doing to commemorate this important milestone? Yeah,
exactly. So we've got a lot going on. Again, so the fundraising campaigns are our way to kind of connect people in Canada to what's been going on, but the actual museum in Europe will have a ton of activity. Normandy will potentially be sinking under the weight of all the people that will be there, but we've got a ceremony planned in conjunction with Veterans Affairs Canada. We're bringing over as many veterans as we possibly can, and that's really the biggest challenge facing us these days. Is the veterans are 94, 95 really at their youngest now. So traveling over to Normandy is increasingly difficult. Even just telling their stories oftentimes is something that's getting harder and harder to do. So that's the biggest question of this anniversary, is how do we deal with it going forward? How do we continue to tell this story in the future? And that's why the teacher program that we have and the student programs are so important, because that's how we can get the younger generation involved. So on June 6th, we'll have a big ceremony at 11 o'clock France time. I believe it's going to be streamed live in Canada. It will be 4 a.m. I believe, probably 3 a.m. here on the West Coast, but I believe Global and CTV and all them will be streaming that live, so people can watch at home or at least catch the highlights afterwards.
And there'll be a host of world leaders there.
Yep, exactly.
To commemorate this, including I think our own Prime Minister's attending.
Yes, we are planning on him being there. I don't think it's been officially confirmed, but
and do we know yet if the Queen is attending?
Not sure on that one quite yet. I haven't heard the official.
She herself is getting a little older.
Exactly.
It may not be an occasion.
But no, they will be awash with dignitaries and awash with veterans and people that just want to come out and see things. So I believe we'll have about 10,000 people at the ceremony itself.
Wow.
Already confirmed, and I don't know if they're planning on making that more than it currently is. So the ceremony there, and then there's going to be ceremonies in pretty much every village and at the cemeteries as well in the time surrounding that.
What an amazing time to be there, Scott. I'm so happy for you that you get to experience that.
I am very excited to go. Yeah, it's going to be a lot of fun.
Scott, why do you do what you do?
That's a great question. I think for me, it's something that when I was in grade 12, I went on one of those battlefield tours. So there was an opportunity to go. And I think for most people, it was just, we get to go to Europe, get to have fun. I've been a history nerd since I was 11 years old.
Nerds rule the
desperately wanted to go. Exactly. And so, but just seeing that history firsthand and seeing it that this is actually something real and that people still care over there and that there are still these markings. And again, that there are 6,000 Canadians that are buried in Normandy.
Yes.
And no one told them to go there. No one forced them to do it. They did it of their own accord. And they lost their lives. And most of them were, again, not older than I am right now.
Yes.
So I think I had that revelation when I was 18, and I want to do as much as I can to give that same revelation to as many 18-year-olds that are coming up. Because I don't think if we forget what happened, then what was it all for? That's essentially, at the end of the day, why the museum continues to exist and continues to tell its story. And for the museum itself, that's always been the main goal of the museum. The veterans that were founded were very adamant, this is not going to be a D-Day museum, this is not going to be an artifact museum, we're not going to just have tanks that we can show off, we are going to tell the entirety of the Canadian story. So we tell the whole thing. We talk about Canadians in Italy and in Northwest Europe and in the Atlantic and at Hong Kong. We tell the whole story and we make sure that we're focused on youth, both French and Canadian and British and from anywhere else, so that we can get that next generation involved to make sure that they can ask their own questions too. Because I feel like, again, with a population of 11 million Canadians in 1939, 1.1 million of them serving in the armed forces, if you had family that lived in Canada in 1939, one of them was serving in the armed forces. That's almost guaranteed. Three of my great-grandfather's uncles, or three of my great-uncles, three of my great-grandfather's uncles signed up. One of them lost their lives in Sicily. So there's that whole stretch of family history I think a lot of people are unaware of, largely, again, because they simply didn't want to talk about it when they got back. Yeah.
So now it's our role to speak for them.
Exactly.
In this time and place, and that's wonderful that you're living this legacy, and continue to. So your grandfather would be very, very proud of you, Scott.
I'll do what I can.
And as a Canadian, I am too. I'm very proud of the work that the Juno Beach Centre Association is doing, and preserving the memory of this event and the World War II. People that sacrificed for our freedoms and the peace that we have. They say sometimes to overcome a greater evil is needed, and I think that's what happened here in this war. Unfortunately, we had to go to war, but we were all much better for it.
Exactly.
So junobeach.org, your website, is full of wonderful information for viewers.
Exactly. So they can go to www.junobeach.org, find out about how to visit, but also a lot of the history is being told there. If you want to contribute to either of these wonderful donation programs we have, there's the donate tab there, and then the dog tag campaign is called 5,500 Canadian Stories, because again, we want to tell those 5,500 Canadian stories themselves. We've got a wonderful program going on right there as well. It's called Legacy of Honors. So if you search Juno Beach Legacy of Honors, one of our directors is going around and interviewing as many Second World War veterans as he possibly can to get them to give their testimony and talk about what happened. It's been a fantastic program, and it's really unearthed a lot of stories that we can tell.
Wonderful. Scott, thank you so much for joining us today and for helping to promote this very important 75th anniversary. And good luck to you and all the people there at the Juno Beach Centre for the work that you're doing. We really do appreciate this.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me.
You're very welcome. And we'll have you back in the fall to talk about the youth tour that you're doing this summer.
Exactly.
We'll have a couple of those youths with
Hopefully,
you. Yeah, okay.
Sounds great.
Thank you for joining us. And just have a moment to pause and think about those that came before us to serve and sacrifice their lives for the peace and freedom that we're so able to experience here today.